And Charlie Guswell is a friend of mine. So,
A little bit of background about you. You are in the restaurant or catering business today?
I'm in the event catering business.
What is the name of the company?
Steve Chick.
And you were with Youthcraft when?
From 1963 until 1986.
What was your position at the end?
I was sales representative. I covered the eastern United States, southeastern United States, in basically Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, big cities, which would have been Birmingham, Atlanta, North and South Carolina,
I see. And
Pennsylvania, Delaware.
now your father was one of the owners,
My father was a minority owner,
and his name was what?
Robert Chick.
Was he an owner until the end?
Yes.
Was he an owner on day one too?
No. The company started after the war by Leon Carrison. There was, Leon Carrison was associated with his brother Julius. And originally the business called Louis Walters was owned by their uncle, Louis Walters. And Leon went off to war, and that company, which started in the 30s with a brand name called Betty Jean, everyone had names. They were usually female names, and they made women's outerwear. They made coats. And Leon was in the war. I think he came out as a colonel or a lieutenant colonel, and I think later he was made a colonel. When he came back, he started a junior suit house called Youthcraft, one word. And so that's why the name came out Youthcraft. It was never, when we got into the coat business, that's when the name never felt exactly right. But they were first a junior suit house in the 40s. It was hard to get fabric, from what I understand, at that time.
It always sticks on my tongue. I want to say youth coat for some reason, which doesn't make any
Youthcraft.
sense.
It was a junior suit house, and my father was a coat man. He started out with Betty Rose or Stern Sledman Prince.
We better get this on tape. So
I'm rolling.
Oh, I haven't even started yet.
Sorry, dude.
Okay.
I was getting some other. Wanted to get a couple of other things. Your date of birth is.
July the 5th.
You don't give the year.
People think I'm younger. I think I'm younger.
Okay, you don't want to give the year.
Yeah.
Was your position always a sales rep
Yes.
in the years you were with the company? Now we're ready to start.
Okay.
I have to give this little introduction and then we'll go from there. Welcome to another interview for the Kansas City Garment Industry Project. I better start my tape. Welcome to another interview for the Kansas City Garment Industry Project. Today is May 18th, 2010. I'm John Dvorak, and I'm interviewing Steve Chick, who worked for many years in his family company, Youthcraft Coats. The videographer is Mark Titus. Steve, tell me a little bit about the founding of Youthcraft and what led to its founding.
Okay. The company was founded by Leon Carrison, who was a nephew of Louis Walters, and there was a prior company called Louis Walters and Betty Jean Coats, and that was run by his brother Julius. That started in the 30s, and they Leon went off to the Second World War, and when he came back, he could not really get into the coat business, and was my understanding because there was fabric shortages. And so they started a company in 1946. It was incorporated in Delaware, called Youthcraft, and it was basically a junior suit house. My father had been with Stern Slegman Prince, which was Betty Rose coats. Everyone used female names, and he was a coat man with them. That's what they did, were coats. And so he joined Leon as a partner, and I don't know exactly whether it was right at that time in 1950. It was not a full partner. He was a minority partner, and it was my understanding that he owned 25% of the company at that time. Dad was sales manager. His title at that time was sales manager, and through the whole company's life, he was the only sales manager. His title eventually became executive vice president, but that's what he did. And what my father did was to design the line, what we call designing the line. He was not a designer as such, but his father, my grandfather, had been a men's tailor, and my father would shop stores for garments that were selling well in the coat departments, and he might buy something because he liked the look of the collar or the way the shoulder looked, or maybe it was the entire style. And then he would work with a pattern maker who we called designers, and they then would make a pattern based on maybe the entire coat, but maybe just a part of the coat. And they would then try it on models, and that's how the line was created. Then my dad, what he did then was, and of course he worked with Leon, but Leon was the production person. Leon was out in the factory working with the staff there that made piecework. They put it together by pieces, and we would try and cut as many of a single garment in sizes as you could, as you could sell.
Now, your father was named Robert Check.
Correct.
Did he and you talk about the business when you were a youth? Were you well acquainted with the business?
I mean, I remember when I was a little kid, and Stern Slegman Prince was located in North Kansas City. It's interesting, it's now a condominium. And it was funny, I was thinking about this yesterday. I remember there was a plastic model as a kid, this was interesting to me, of their new building, which ended up on between Linwood and 31st Street on Gillon. And the building is still there, and so is the tall building in North Kansas City on Armour. And but by the time, I guess that building opened around 1950. And what I remember about Youthcraft then was, as a kid, going down to 311 West 8th, and that's where the original building, where we originally started. And that was called Kansas City Boys Wear, and it was owned by the Plotskys. And we were on we were on, I've forgotten what, 1 or 2 floors. There was a small building, and as a kid, I remember the fabrics, and I remember my dad had an office probably not as big as this one, and the windows faced a brick wall. As a kid, that's what I remember then.
Do you know what drove your dad? What he liked about the garment business and the coat business?
Let me tell you about the coat business in general, and what I remember. As the business grew, and what my dad liked about it, he originally traveled in Iowa and Illinois for Stern Sleigher Betty Rose. And when you would go in, and when I started in the business, and you would go into a store, you were a star. This was the biggest purchase that a ready-to-wear store would make, was coats. They were more expensive than dresses. This is really before the sportswear business. And people carried coats, suits, and dresses in these stores. And so if you went into a ready-to-wear store in Iowa or Illinois or wherever it was, you only saw them twice a year, and you had a spring season and fall season. In the dress business then, there were 4 seasons, and what they call transitional and holiday. And you didn't have that in coats, so people would come in, a salesman, and it was important to them because this was their major purchase that they would buy with a single vendor. And you felt like something. It's, you were, when I traveled, and I guess, when my dad was in that, when I would come into a store, I didn't generally just see the buyer. I saw the owner of the store. If it was a larger store, I saw the general manager or the divisional or the GM, in many cases the owners. It was an important purchase for them.
How did the company do in the early days, in the late 40s and the 50s?
Well, in the 50s, like I said, we were in 311. I think that was, they did some manufacturing there, and the whole thing was done there, but it was a small operation. And as it became larger, and they hired more salesmen, they covered larger areas, they joined up with Lewis Walter at 416 West 8th. Again, it's interesting, that's a condominium today. It was actually the first building that turned condominium, and in the garment area. And Lewis Walter was a sales company, Youthcraft was a sales company. Neither one of them then manufactured their own garments. There was a company called Coronet, and Coronet was, I don't know, what would you call it? It was really just, Coronet manufactured the coats for both companies, and that way they had a larger volume. And at this 416 West 8th, on the first floor was Lewis Walter Betty Jean Coats, their offices and their receiving room and their shipping room. And on the second floor was Youthcraft, same thing. Coronet, the president of Coronet was Harry Carrison. Harry Carrison was the father of Leon and Julius Carrison. And I'm trying to think of what his title was. Virgil Gibbs was the father-in-law of Leon Carrison, and Virgil was really an accountant. And what he did was he took the sales records of both companies and determined the cuttings. On the top floor, which would have been the sixth floor, I believe, was the cutting room. And that cutting room cut garments for both companies. They were sales companies. It's interesting, you know.
So did Youthcraft never actually manufacture coats?
Yeah, we'll get to that. As we got bigger, Lewis Walter got smaller. The Renee Check and Robert Check, Renee, and she was the designer in the same capacity that my father was. With Youthcraft, she was the designer for Lewis Walter. And in 1963, they actually separated, and eventually she got out of the business for a year, got back in the business. They ended up getting a divorce. During that period of time, I know our sales, and I had joined the company, and I was traveling, and our sales had skyrocketed, and their sales had gone in the opposite direction. So we decided, we being Youthcraft, that we needed more space, and we moved to the Poindexter building at 801 Broadway. They continued to stay, or they being Louis Walters, stayed in their building. We separated completely. There was, I would tell you, I know there was jealousy between the two brothers, because one, the older one, his business had gone the other direction, and ours had skyrocketed. And our building in the Poindexter building was the second floors through the 7 floors. And not the entire building, the first floor was still Poindexter. And then there were 2 sub-basements, and we had nothing to do with it. But that was an enormous building for garments. And there were 2 freight elevators and 3 other elevators, I think, in that building at that time. And each floor was 28,000 square feet. I'm kind of a figure guy. So it was just a much larger, and our business called for that. And at our peak at 801 Broadway, we had over 700 employees. It was, I know, the biggest company in town.
Why was it so successful?
I think my dad always said it was 3 ways. First of all, we designed a beautiful garment. Secondly, we had the right salespeople, and we manufactured it, and it was done on time, and it sold in the stores. I mean, we had I guess a very good sales force to sell, but we had the right product, and we had to manufacture it. So it was all 3 of them. One was never, Dad always said, none was more important than the other.
So at some point in the 50s, you began manufacturing your own product?
No, it was in the 60s.
60s.
Yeah.
Before that, you would have designed the coat, but then turned the design over to Coronet.
We turned the pattern to Coronet. The pattern would have been made. My dad would look at a garment and say, okay, I'm doing it this way and this way. Then his designer would then make a pattern. Then they would put the pattern on a model and correct it. You know, first it would have been on just a form, and then they would bring in a real model. And my stepmother did some corrections. What we call corrections is she had she had been a model at Swanson's, and the garments would be then made on her.
And then Coronet was not a sales company.
No.
They manufactured.
They only manufactured everything.
Where did the fabric come from?
For the most part, in those years, it would come from New York. We did have some imported fabrics. We got into the fake fur business and did really well with it, and we were probably one of the first ones that bought from a French company I remember called Tissevel, and there was a German company as well, and I think it was in 1971 and 72, my dad and his wife and Leon and his wife traveled to Europe to meet the people, even though they would come here, and they traveled there to make purchases, and other people did too.
Do you know, was Kansas City and Youthcraft a fashion trendsetter, or were we more utilitarian and followed what New York was doing?
No, we were a trendsetter. We sold, like all of the other companies in Kansas City, they sold mainly, the company sold mom and pop stores. That was really what the basics of the business was, except for people like Brandon Puritz. They sold chains, but less expensive chains. We sold, and so did like Fashion Build and Stern Slegman, Betty Rose. The basis of their business was in a small town in small stores. Now, by small town, that could be 50,000 people, let's say, but it was much easier. Those people were, many cases, didn't travel to New York, and they would travel to the Chicago market, was the big one. They would travel to Charlotte. That was big then, bigger than Atlanta. Then Charlotte, I understand, is non-existent, and now people go to Atlanta. But it was too expensive for many of these small towns to travel to New York. In many cases, I think they'd probably be intimidated unless they had a New York buying office. And we sold these mom and pop stores, but in the 60s, when I started coming in there, I was young and perhaps stupid, not afraid to walk into a big city store, and that's what I did. And so we started then, and in Texas as well, we started selling these big, better stores, and we had the right merchandise. It was just trying to get in the door, and that's what we did. That's what made our business grow.
Did Youthcraft coats, in the best of the times, were they sold all over the United States?
Yes.
Were there parts of the United States
even,
that you concentrated on, or was it truly a nationwide product?
Well, it was a nationwide product, but the big part of our business was in the Southeast, which I covered, and in Texas, Oklahoma. That was huge for us. We did far more business there than we did, let's say, in Missouri, Kansas.
Now, you said the company had about 700 employees in its
peak,
in the best of times. Can you give me an idea of what those employees did? Were most of them involved in manufacturing, or were most in sales, or how did that break down?
No, we had only at the most we had at one time 13 salesmen. So the office amount of people were small. I could probably figure it out. I don't know. Between the core people in the office and the salespeople, it probably wouldn't have numbered more than 30. So you had over 600, 650, something like that at our peak, manufacturing it. Youthcraft, in the 60s and 70s, when we moved into the Poindexter building, the top floor was nothing but cutting room, 28,000 square feet. They said it was the largest, and this isn't meant for ego or what, but it was the largest cutting floor in the United States that made coats. There's nothing like it. I mean, that was almost a city block, and there were 4 tables that cut garments up there. So
Was all your manufacturing in that building
Yes,
at that time?
at that time, yes.
Did you use the method that Kansas City popularized, sort of the assembly line method, as opposed to one worker doing the entire
Well, that's,
coat?
yeah, my grandfather made a men's suit from collar to cuff, but what we did was piecework. And people would, they had these baskets that rolled, and they were paid by the sewers were paid by the number of pieces that they could do. And one might just put together the collar, and one might put together the right sleeve, and you know, at some point you put together the whole thing. We pressed everything. I think probably one of the highest, the two highest paid people, or parts of it, I know at that point would have been the pressers and people putting on, we did a lot of real fur collared work, and those were highly skilled people, but it was the pressers, everything that before it went out of our company, you know, was packed, everything was pressed, and everything looked perfect when it left, and then when they were packed with tissue paper, and it was fascinating to see how that was done.
Did you make both men's and women's coats?
Oh no, only women's.
Only women's?
Only women's.
Did you make any other clothing? Or
We made
just-
suits. We got, we always, suits were always a part of our business because it had started as a junior suit house. But I think that ended very quickly when my father joined, but then eventually we got back into the suit business.
Women's suits? only?
Women's, better, what was considered better in the department. At one time, we bought a company or two in New York that made suits, and they were made under our label. So, but again, I was trying to think of the name, but it was, they were better suits, and that included the suit, the two-piece suit, let's say, the skirt and the jacket, and a blouse as well. Some of them didn't have blouses.
Where did your coats rank in the overall scheme of things? Were they considered on the expensive side or on the lesser expensive
No,
side?
we were always expensive. We were high-end.
You were not the most expensive.
We would have been in Kansas City the most expensive. There was another company here called Fashion Built. They were one of the last ones actually to go out of business there. And they made a cashmere coat. And cashmere being a precious fiber, and they sold better stores. Theirs were considered more basic type. We also made rainwear, and again, ours were high-end. We made leather coats, or we sold leather coats under our design, but those were made in Korea. And it was never a successful, and I don't think they ever really made any money on it. We sold some, but it was never a big part of our business. What had happened, I may be getting ahead of you, but Lewis Walter ended up closing in Kansas City and moved to California. And one thing that they did was to get into the leather business, and that was the idea of Renee Chick. And their leather and suede coats were made in Spain, and they were beautifully done. They fit beautifully, and somehow they got on Price is Right as a giveaway. It was an interesting story, and they were very pretty coats, and all of a sudden that skyrocketed them back into business. They were, from what I understand, when they moved to California, they were practically gone. And this all of a sudden revitalized them, and they also came up with a cashmere-like synthetic fabric that was fantastic for the southern states. Southern states, where we did the majority of our business, never wanted a heavy coat. Coats in New York were many times done with an inner lining for warmth, and we offered that to our northern clients in eastern, but the majority of our business, Kansas City firms sold in the south, and that's a very short season. So if you came up with a lightweight coat, and women in those days, they wore suits, and they put a coat on over a suit, and it was adequate for them. So they were always looking for a lightweight fabric, and we manufactured that too.
Were your coats wool?
Oh yeah, we did wool, and we did, later we got into synthetics.
How many years would you say were good for the company?
By good, I'm assuming that you mean good sales. It never seemed, it never seemed bad to me, even in the late 80s, because my business was still good. I just got tired I just didn't want to travel anymore. Our business was still good. It wasn't as good, but I would guess in the early 80s it really changed, and it was hard. What happened in Kansas City happened in all the other towns. You had these mom and pop stores that were going out of business, and you didn't have new people coming into the business, and that's as far as time frame. The 60s, most of the 70s were fantastic, and
were the 50s pretty good too?
Well, I wasn't really there in the 50s, but the 50s were growth years for us, because they started in 1950, as I mentioned earlier, and at some point in the 50s we moved from one place to a much larger place, and then moved again in the 60s.
What I was trying to get clear, it wasn't just that the company had 2 or 3 good years. There were many, many years when the company did well.
Yeah.
What would in a typical year be a approximation for gross sales?
We did at our peak 21 million.
Where would that have ranked you in terms of both the Kansas City garment industry and the national industry?
Well, it was big. In the late 60s, our company became part of a holding company called CBK Industries, and that was the brainchild of a man whose last name was Dominic, and he was then the president of Traders Bank, and we became a tradable commodity on the American Stock Exchange over that, because they were then a holding company of Youthcraft. And so what Youthcraft then did is we went into the New York market, and we bought several other coat companies. Actually, we bought the oldest company in the United States then was called Lassie Junior Coats. This was a company that made a boy coat, what was called a boy coat. This was a camel hair, double-breasted coat. Sorry, my phone. It was a double-breasted notch collar coat with a half belt in the back. And we bought that company. That coat came out, I think, at the end or sometime during the First World War. And that's how old that company was. And we bought that company as a tax write-off in the late 60s or early 70s. I've forgotten. And they owned another company. We bought them. And what also made Youthcraft popular was in 1965, we went into what was called the Carca Business. This is a short coat meant to be worn, I guess, as a casual coat with slacks. You have to keep in mind, in the 60s, when I would travel into towns like Nashville or Dyersburg or any small town in West Virginia that I would go into, I would go in there and they would sit down to work with me, and the women would be wearing hats. I mean, it was such a different thing, and if we went out to lunch, they'd put on their white gloves, and they, you felt great because, they would come in and they were all dressed up to see you. It was fun. If you went out to eat, you went to, of course we took them, and you go into the best place in town and everyone was dressed up. It was a different thing. Then we got into 1965. My father wanted to get into the Carca business. There was a manufacturer called Penguin in Minneapolis that made Carcos, and they made a higher priced Carco. By that, I would tell you, they sold for between $50 and $60 for the most part. And so we got into that business in 1965, and we made coats. We made a corduroy. These are short coats, car coats. We made a short coat for $14.75 was our cheapest one, and the most expensive one was $29.75. And at $29.75, that could sell at 40% markup. It would be $49.99 in stores, $49.95, and some of the better stores would mark them $55 to $60. So that put us in competition with this Penguin. And all of a sudden we took that line out in January, and this was a fall line. It's just strictly made for fall. And we took that line out then when, especially when I would travel sometimes, it snowed terribly. It was hard to get around. And that line took off, and it what sold the best in it were things from $25.75 to $29.75, and the more expensive ones sold the best. And that was probably the turning point of what made us big, Country Pacer coats. And that line that you traveled with for like January, February, and maybe the first week in March. And at the end of March, 1st of April, you went out with Youthcraft, which was the dress coat line. So,
now you joined the company in 1963
correct.
as a salesman.
Correct.
And what was, in a nutshell?
Actually, it was probably 1962 even. I went there as, I traveled as an assistant to the salesman. And the only way you could get a line is if someone dropped dead or if you killed them. So I traveled with about 6 different guys, and one of them had a bad heart condition. And after my driving, I can tell you, and his wife calling him, he was from Seattle, Washington. His wife used to call him at 3 o'clock in the morning. And we never slept, of course, in the same room, but it was always adjoining or next to it. I always heard the phone ring. And he was always taking nitroglycerin pills. And after I finished with him, he decided to retire. And he wasn't that old. His name was Joe Kaufman. He was probably 50 years old. And he retired, and I took his line. I got his line. That was Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio.
By line, you mean a series of stores? Or
I took his territory, is what I did.
So what did you do then? You just went from town to town?
I went from town to town, but I always traveled by appointment. And I remember traveling with him, and he would never make an appointment. He would just, for the most part, sometimes he would make an appointment, but he generally would just show up, and sometimes they might be working with another person. And I remember the first trip I made was to Paducah, Kentucky, and I always knew to get there early, and I had planned to go to this store there. We'd already sold, they were already a client. And I got there, and it was the first day of their sale, and I knew that this was called Paducah Dry Goods, and it was 1965, it was in January, and I figured there were people waiting to get into the store outside. It was a crowd. And so I turned around and I drove down to another town that was close by, where I had observed this store before, and I remember I got down there very early, and I saw this car, which was a competitor from, it actually happened to be Lewis Walter, because they already had the store, and I went in there, and I was a young kid, and I got a place to park right in front, went in, talked them into looking at the line, wheeled the line in, and as I was in the car getting the stuff out, I see this guy, I've forgotten his name, from Louis Walter, who was my competitor, and I got in there before him, and I remember they never sold them again. I went in there and I sold them, and it was kind of fun to do, but I'm sure the same thing happened to me too.
Now you would go into what, a department store or a store that sold only women's clothing?
Yeah, and some were department stores. Many, for the most case, I remember that particular store was like an old-time department store. It carried everything, even what they called notions then, but they carried men's and women's. But where we did best was generally with a specialty store, like some place they would have the style shop, and they carried strictly women's. And we traveled differently then. My father insisted that we look good when we traveled, so we all had Cadillac limousines. We all traveled in Cadillac limousines, the entire sales force. And
company owned?
No. We were all commission people, and they would give us advance on our earnings so that you could pay for your expenses on the road. But we were strictly commissioned, so whatever cost you on the road, that's what it cost you. And in those days, we made a deal with Greenlease Cadillac here in Kansas City, and we leased these Cadillac limousines, and you'd take out the back seats, and we had racks that were made, and the garments would fit on those, and they'd be in bags, and they'd be packed. I remember at some point, the largest line we ever had 156 different styles in it, and at the end we might have 70, 80, but these were all different styles and available in maybe one color to 6 colors.
So you would take into the store manager 100 garments or whatever the number was.
You'd have,
and it would be one example of all of your coats in
correct,
one size.
Yes, they were all. Then we made size 10s. I think today they make size 6s as samples, maybe 4s even. But to be a coat model, what they call a coat model, she had to have big shoulders. And actually, when I first started, they made size 12s, and that was a big gal, even then. And then they went down to size 10s, and our sample sizes were 10s. And you have to keep in mind too, like in the 60s, we made fur collared coats, and some of them were foxes or lynx, and these were big, and when you had them in a bag, you could get maybe up to 8 in a bag, in specially made hangers, and the hanger had a steel rod that would go through it. And I traveled with, let's say, all of those, and by the second year I traveled also with an assistant that did the driving and packing. I mean, not that I wouldn't do it, too, because it took that many people, and I travel with a model most of the time.
A model?
Yeah, that put the garments on. And then I had 3 rolling racks in the trunk, and these are big. Ours had, for a coat rack, because they were heavy, the wheels were probably 5 inches around and heavy. And people that had dresses, they had small wheels. But again, you're dealing with a coat that weighed 3 or 4 pounds, and in each bag there might be 12 to 16, an average of probably 14 garments in a bag, sitting on a rack. 5 racks could go on one of these rolling racks coming in there. And in most of the cases you take in 8 to 12 bags. So, and then you set it up, and if you were working in a store. Now, what I tried to do in most cases, and I did this myself, and so did Nate Plattner, who worked for us in Texas, is that we went into, I would set up in a motel or a hotel in a suite, and I would set up, I traveled with lights, I had a Stanley steamer that steamed the coats at night, and sometimes I would be there for a day, but many times 2 to 3 days in different towns. And we were so big, we were so important to these stores that they would drive in, 50 to 100 miles into Jackson, Tennessee, into Nashville, into Bluefield, West Virginia, into these different towns, and the client would come to see me, and it was an occasion for them, because then we would schmooze, and that was all the fun part of the business.
So you might go to the store, or the store owner might come to you.
Me. Yeah, the buyer. Can we take a break?
Sure.
And the same person that did our drawings of our garments did Wolf Brothers here, which was a great store. If you were from Kansas City, that's what we used the same artists that they used. And Hartsfeld, that people did drawings, they didn't do photos like they do today.
Mm-hmm.
So, they were all drawn out like that.
One question before we turn on the tape.
He's already on. This guy, he's afraid he's going to miss something.
Don't miss a thing. I'm going to interrupt John 1 second.
Yeah.
I've done some, was there ever did Calvin Films ever shoot a documentary about the Kansas City Garment District, or was there ever any kind of, in the Midwest, Kansas City is the center of the garment district, and Calvin Films was great for doing stuff like industrial films.
They used to say that every 7th woman in America wore a garment made in Kansas City. So you look at that, that's over 14% of the people. And this was a coat town. There were a few dress manufacturers here, but one I remember was called Slim Maker. They actually was a great name because they made dresses for big women, Slim Maker. Then there was my cousin Eddie Jacobs. He made maternity wear here. Again, but these were not big people. They weren't big manufacturers. The one that was big was Gay Gibson. That was a dress manufacturer that was quite famous because she was the first one to manufacture in large quantities dresses. St. Louis was known as the dress town. We were known as the coat town.
What I was going to ask you before we go back on my tape, there are Youthcraft coats available from vintage clothing companies today on the web.
Oh, really?
What are those? They're not garments manufactured in the 70s and 80s, are they?
Yeah, probably.
Oh.
I mean, our things, the problem always was that they would say that our coats wore like iron, was the term that they would use, and they never wore out. And we, it's funny, I hadn't thought about this in years, we would replace a lining. As long as a woman wanted to wear a coat, and if the lining wore out, we would replace the lining at no charge.
Jeez.
And, to give you an idea, now I went in here in Kansas City, I go to, in Brookside, Eric at Rubel's, Eric Blond, and his father, before he died, so this was about 3 years ago, replaced a lining in a coat that I have, and a good coat. And I thought he was very reasonable, charged me $160 to reline that coat. And then first time I wore that coat after that, I got out of the car or something and I tore the fabric in this coat, and I need to take it to Plaza Weavers. That'll probably cost me $100 at least to repair that coat.
Well, I just was starting to punch the name into the web the other night, and something called Vintage Clothing Company popped up, and there's a Youthcraft coat. I called my wife in, and she looked at it. She said, "That's a great coat. Does that date back to the 80s?"
Could date back to the 60s even, or even farther. And if the things are left on the inside, there's tags on the inside I could actually identify what season it was and what year it was and exactly what size was there as well.
Well, we're going back on the record. We're going to continue to talk about your traveling the country. When you traveled the country selling, were you in direct competition with salespeople from other companies?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Did you see each other?
I always worked by appointment, so it would be rare for me to see. And I did go to Chicago in the very beginning, and they had a market there I'm trying to think of the name. It was owned by the Kennedy family.
The merchandise market.
The merchandise market. I went there in the very beginning. It was a more expensive thing to do, and I didn't feel that it added anything to my business. But in later years, because my territory was so big, I went to Charlotte, and I actually went to Atlanta as well. And I, got business from maybe a little bit of new business, but it was kind of fun and a little bit different to do. And I had to plan my trips around people and making appointments that they wouldn't be at the show, or I would be at that particular show. I also went to New York, and I set up in the Essex House, and I worked with New York people. That was before we had a New York showroom. And so we bought a company in New York, which was Lassie, and they had New York representation. That was one of the reasons we bought them. Besides, they were a $600,000 tax write-off that year, because that's how much the business they lost, and or how much they'd lost in business. And they had an office on the 4th floor, the 512 building. There were two primary coat buildings in New York: 512 7th Avenue and 520 or 527th Avenue, and they were on the 4th floor there. And so we made a showroom there, and we then had New York representation. But even before that, I decided to go into New York, and I didn't work with New York stores, but I had stores from Rochester and Albany that came there and worked with me, and stores from Pennsylvania that worked with me in New York. And it was cheap for me. I did a lot of business, so it was also somewhat of a vacation.
Was the competition gentlemanly, or were you really out there hustling to get business and sell yourself over the other companies?
It just was never hard for me. I don't know. Again, I think I was young and maybe innocent. Was never. We were in direct competition with New York, and I never considered the people in Kansas City as my competitors. I considered New York. I think you had to look at it in a bigger way. So New York was our competition strictly, and in the beginning we were in competition, let's say, with Louis Walders and perhaps some with Betty Rose, but Betty Rose was a far less expensive line. They'd been around a lot longer than we had, probably easily 20 to 30 years longer, but we were a different type of company. We were more aggressive, and we were, none of us were afraid to go into better stores. We were always looking for new business.
How did you feel? You were a young guy, you're going around the United States, New York, Chicago, selling a top quality coat. How did you feel? I mean, you must have thought you were the cat's meow.
I thought it was God. I mean, you could go in to these small stores, and we were like movie stars going in. I traveled in the beginning. I was 23 years old when I got the line to go out and to sell it, and I traveled with my wife, who was gorgeous, and she was 22 years old, I was 23, and we would pull up in a town like Logan, West Virginia, where people would move their cars. I mean, it's hard to get a place to park, and stores were busy, these towns, and you pull up in front, and I'd go in and, could someone move this car so we could get out? They'd move the car in. She was dressed in a beautiful suit with jewelry, and her hair was up, and she was very pretty, and I had a custom-made suit on, and we were like movie stars there. We were, it was for that store owner, store buyer, again, this was their large purchase. We made money for them. If we didn't make any money, they wouldn't be that anxious to see us. And again, we only came around twice a year, basically, until we came out with the short coat or car coat line, and then it was 3 times. So, they were happy to see us, and when you're young and think that you can do anything anyway, it was relatively easy.
How many weeks a year would you be on the road, roughly?
I would travel, the fall line that we traveled with was April and May, and I was back in June. And the spring line, we would travel in September and October, or actually mid-September to second week in November. When I first traveled, lines came out a little bit later. And I remember traveling, the first time I ever went out with Joe Kaufman, I was in Evanston, Indiana, when the Kennedy funeral was going on. But that was the last that I ever remember traveling that late. So then you would be off June, July, and August. And in the beginning, we didn't have the Carca line, so then you'd be off January, February, and March. And you'd be off November and December, basically. We traveled 4 months a year. And, I traveled as fast as I could because time meant money that you'd be spending.
What did you do the other months of the year?
I played golf. I went to California, and I'd spent 7 weeks sitting at the beach.
You went to work?
I went to Mexico for a month or 6 weeks.
You wouldn't work the telephones?
It wasn't really necessary then. We would call. You kept in somewhat touch with the larger stores that, let's say they bought 10 pieces of style 1000. And they sold 6 of them, and they would go to reorder it to fill it in. The little stores never did that to a big degree. Some of the better small stores did, but they would call in their orders, or they would, there weren't fax machines then. They would generally call in their orders, or many times put a stamp on and send us an order.
Boy, things have sure changed, haven't they?
They changed a lot, yes.
You didn't sell to Walmart, did you?
No, we didn't sell to Walmart. There weren't any. There was the cheapest store that I remember selling to was a store just outside of Nashville, but I would never tell anybody that I sold it, but they were really nice people. Their name was McAdoo. I remember that, and they originally was McAdoo's 5 and 10, but I think the reason it started was that the owner, who I remember was this good-looking, dark-haired woman, she wanted to get something for herself, and so she tried to order something, and we told her what she had to buy the line, and so she says, okay, send it in. And so they had 2 stores, one in Lebanon and one some town, I think it was Springfield, is north of Nashville. They really were an inexpensive store. And then we sold another store called Parks Belk in Tennessee, and again, we were really their high end. That ended up being part of the Belk chain, which is quite a chain, but this was in a small town, and we sold several of them. We were always their high end, but it was fun to sell them. They were nice people.
When did you begin to feel that things weren't going quite as well as they had?
I can tell you exactly. I came into the stores one time. We were always in a prime location in a store, in a department store. We were first floor, near an elevator, in a great spot. One day I come into one of the stores that we sold. This was actually a Baltimore store called Stewart Company, and I'm looking for the coat department, and it has moved to the second floor. And so I said to the buyer, I said, what's going on here? Why are we up here on the second floor? And he said, well, sportswear, what they call changes, the amount of turns that they make in sportswear was at 5 to 6 turns a year. The coat department only changed twice a year, and so the stores began to realize that the turn is where they made their money, was how many times they could change their stock, and so that's when it started to change. And then I remember one time I went into a store in Nashville that sold called Castor Knox. It was a mercantile store, and I looked for the coat department, and the coat department had been moved over in front of the office area. It moved away from even the second floor top of the elevator, and they moved it over there. And I called my dad and I said, business is really changing, and these small town stores are, in many cases, a son or a daughter. They didn't want to go into that business anymore. It was like the restaurant business. They're married to it, and they worked too hard, and it was too hard to make a buck. And stores that weren't changing were, let's say, in a small town of 10 to 20,000 people, the stores are all located around the center part of the downtown, and all of a sudden they started to build shopping centers out on a bypass. And if that store downtown didn't move out there and pay, that in many cases they own their building downtown, so they didn't want to move. And if they didn't go out to the shopping center, then they were slowly going out of business in the downtown area. And that's what I started to see was the change, is these mom and pop stores were going out of business, and if they went out of business, you didn't really have anyone to replace them with. And then what happened too with the chains is, when you look at it today, it's the same stores. It's Macy's and it's Dillard's, and we started selling Dillard's years ago when they first started coming out in business. They started out in Texas, and they were a major client of ours. And we stayed with them, but then stores started changing where the chains, they didn't really go out of business, but they were gobbled up by other people.
So it was a combination of changes in the stores and changes in what people wanted to wear?
I don't think it was what people wanted to wear. What also changed too for us, we made a classy, better garment. We made a garment with hand-bound buttonholes, and all of a sudden, and I guess this was in the early 80s, we started changing, or maybe it was in the late 70s. Those were expensive. That took a certain type of person to make that hand-bound buttonhole. And all of a sudden I look at a coat, and here's a coat that was going to sell for $200 in a store perhaps, or $300, and it was made, and this is over 30 years ago, all of a sudden it's made with a machine-bound buttonhole, because we've eliminated that woman that her grandmother might have also been. We had three generations of people in our place, and it became expensive, and so to cut corners they started making that. I think that had something to do with it, and we were trying to be competitive, and we were making things run out of tape.
So just stop for 1 second.
I got a question for you while we're doing that. Did you know Virginia Oppenheimer, Cricket West?
I knew who they were, yeah.
But
We
she
didn't
she
sell.
went to New York to buy her lines, right? So it was her son and I were best friends in grade school, and that's just why I thought about it.
Yeah, I remember the store, but we didn't, and when you said the name, that came to mind.
You talked to your father about this. How did you all feel when you saw some of these changes occurring?
I don't know, at that point, personally, I'd gone through a divorce, and I really had begun to lose interest. My kids live with me, and I tried not to travel as much. I had always had an assistant with me. I was having an assistant do some of the smaller towns, and then I would come, fly in and out, and I just didn't want to travel as much as I used to, because I had kids that were growing up and teenagers, and so I was in and out of town. And I told my father in 1980, as I saw the business changing, I said, I'm giving you 5 years notice. I will be out of this, and that was 30 years ago. And I actually left in 86, and then they closed.
Did you notice the company going downhill in the 80s?
I don't like the word downhill. Our sales, our sales were diminishing, and so was our client. And it was harder to work with the buyers in these big cities because coats were just not as important. They weren't the money maker that they were 10 and 20 and 30 years before that. They used to be a big money maker, and they just weren't a volume. We weren't getting, the stores weren't making the money there in the coats as they used to. And we would tell them to promote them, and we would do special pricing. If your order's placed early, this coat will be $20 off, $10, $20 off of the wholesale. And but we would tell them when retailing it to retail it at the higher level, and then discount it. Everything started to be, you couldn't sell coats at regular price anymore because everyone was discounting them. So for the stores, we suggested, and I did especially to try and be competitive, that they needed to be promoting the coats more. And it used to be that there were 2 sales a year, and then it became there was a sale every month, or there's a sale every day, and it was different to try and get the volume and to get the new things in there all the time. You had to promote things, and these small towns or these mom and pop stores, they weren't brought up like that. And that was a big change, and it wasn't just in the coats. I think it was throughout, and then there weren't people that wanted to go in and do retail anymore. It became a tough business. It wasn't as much what I always say was fun. It used to be a lot of fun, and I just things became far more expensive. I remember traveling. I'd stayed in a lot of Holiday Inns, and they were as low as $8, $6 a night. $10 and $12 was maybe the most you would spend, and then all of a sudden it became $40, $50 for the same room, essentially. And because I had an assistant, and my assistant, I paid all of his expenses and the salary. Well, it was for a 4-month-a-year job that was $40,000 to $50,000 a year that I was paying, 30 years ago.
Was it inevitable then, did you conclude that the business was just no longer going to be successful?
I didn't think the business was going to be the moneymaker that it was when we were so-called stars, when we were a big flash. And we at one point, you get accustomed to traveling a certain way. I always had an assistant. I always had a suite, a couple of 2 to 3 rooms, and then I realized, I'm not making as much money. I'm not doing the volume, and they even tried increasing our commission to cover certain things. Expenses got to be quite high. I don't know how people travel today. I don't think there's hardly any real traveling salesman like there used to be. And you go back to the 30s when my dad traveled in the 40s, and then me in the 60s and 70s and 80s. It was in the 80s, all of a sudden you couldn't really, it was hard to make the same living, but we lived the same way. But we had Youthcraft, we had a private plane. My father would come into meet me in major towns, which were Memphis, Nashville, Chattanooga, Knoxville, Atlanta, Birmingham, Baltimore. He would fly in a private plane with 2 pilots. It seated 22 people, and that's the way we traveled. And here I am, of course, in a limousine with staff. I traveled with a model and an assistant. So.
Now, your father was with the company when it closed?
Yes, he was.
But you were not?
No, I was not. I'd gotten out of it a couple years before and just sort of was able to not do anything. And I told my dad that I was going to go into the restaurant business. And my father looked at me and he says, "You're going to be a waiter?" And I thought it was always funny. And my dad at one time said to me, "One day this will all be yours." And I said, "No, you're the minor partner. It's not going to all be mine." And I didn't have the interest in it anymore. I'm more chameleon. I need to make a change.
When did you leave the company, and what year approximately?
I must have been, I think it was 86, and they were out of business in 88.
Are you familiar with what happened in the final couple of years? What went into their thinking to close the business?
Well, there were a number of factors, but as far as me, I just assume I wouldn't want to tell you anything that might be erroneous. So the talk was that Youthcraft owed a pile of money to the Women's Garment Workers Fund, that, and this was one of the probably deciding factors. We were also starting, what happened too, is that we moved from 801 Broadway to 16th Avenue in North Kansas City, 210 16th Avenue. We had, what we did there is that we had a large shipping room and some hand finishing that was done, but for the most part, our garments were not made in Kansas City anymore, because we found a less expensive way to make them. That's when all of a sudden I said, where are these garments coming from? What happened to Josephine Brancato? And all, we had a huge amount of Italian people and what were called DPs. I remember, we had women with tattoos that they'd been in Auschwitz, and we had a lot of those people, and they, in many cases they had gotten older and retired, and still every once in a while I was reading the paper, so-and-so used to work at Youthcraft, and she was 90-something years old or what, but people retired and they were hard to replace, and plus, we always paid a good wage for those people, and they couldn't afford them anymore. As business started to deteriorate, we started to manufacture our garments in other ways, which basically was in New York.
How did your father feel when the business finally closed?
My father was so depressed over that, and personal things with his partner, that that my dad basically had no control over, that he was a very unhappy man, and that's when he died, he was extremely depressed. My father died of a rare blood disease that hits, according to Gus Eisman, who was his doctor, hits 2 people in 100,000. And the interesting thing is my father's best friend in the business was Marty Lolick, who was the coat buyer for mercantile stores in New York, and Marty died 6 weeks after my dad of the same disease. It hit him, and it's Gus Eisman told me that he would last about a year and a half, and he lasted about a little over 19 months.
You were out of the business by then, but how did you feel when the business closed?
Well, it was a sad thing, but I'd already gone on. I'd gone into the restaurant business, and that was exciting and new, and we were wildly popular, and I really didn't have the time.
Metropolis was the hippest place in town.
I talked to my dad, thank you. I talked to my dad every day, several times a day, and he just was kind of a lost soul. I mean, that was his life. My dad worked 6 days a week. He worked, Monday through Saturday, and that was his thing. And he loved the business. And I have letters that he wrote, my dad put out a bulletin every single week to the salesman, and then when we weren't traveling, we still got a bulletin. It came special delivery, and told you what was going on with Youthcraft, what was happening, or Country Pacer, and we had another line called Voyager West, which was our raincoat line. It was never wildly popular, but we sold some, and then we made a leather line, or we had a leather line. We designed the coats, and those were made in Korea. I forgot to even mention that. But they weren't popular like the ones that came out of Louis Walter. Those were called Julie de Roma. And I don't think they were as well made. We would send one of our factory people, his name was Max Helfand, to Korea, and he'd be over there for 6 weeks overseeing the manufacture of these leather coats. And one time we made rainwear in Taiwan. Again, better, not cheap, but better, but it was never the same thing. People liked our label. It says made in the USA, and it was different, totally different for me to see us making garments that were not made in Kansas City.
A final question.
2 minutes.
Could anything have been done to change what happened, and could Youthcraft have been continuing in business today? Or was there just so many changes that really wasn't feasible?
I don't know. I mean, there's still people making garments, so why couldn't we be there? I think we could, and maybe they still could be today. But manufacturing and selling are two different things, and I think anybody can sell anything. I mean, I've proved that myself. But as far as manufacturing something like when I first started, the type of garment that we made, and then what happened in the 80s and the type of garment that we were making then were two different things. They were not entirely different, but they weren't the same. But the main thing that changed was the way the stores were purchasing and the way the customer was buying, and that was the difference. It's a totally different thing. You could still manufacture garments today, and they're going to sell. Someone's making coats, but they're not. The customer isn't buying them in the same way. And what sold with us was a woman's full-length coat. They were cloth. They might have had fur collars on them, and when they were the best were when people were buying meat-collared coats. That was the most popular thing that we ever made. Those sold at regular price in stores, and the styles changed. And today, you've got when I see things, I think for the most part they're much heavier. And you have people like my kids live in Atlanta. My daughter, because she's used to wearing coats, will wear a short coat. My daughter-in-law, I never see her in a coat. It could be 30 degrees there, and she's gonna
20
just
seconds.
wear something else. Ran out of time.
20 seconds.
20 seconds. Well, that's it. Thanks.
Oh,